So again, thank you all for tuning in. So as you see, this talk is titled Reshaping the World, an Empirical Method for Applied Conceptual Engineering. And that's a bit of a weird talk, because it's somehow a work in progress for a future project in conceptual engineering. And just so you have some sort of background in your mind when I'm presenting this stuff, maybe that can help you with trying to get what I'm aiming at. It is meant for somehow a large project. By that I mean a project that would not only be involving myself, but would be a collective project, and that would be meant to run over a couple of years, between like 4 to 7 years or something like that. So you have to kind of picture the background. So the assumption that is made here is that conceptual engineering, the way in which I take it, it is about changing people's mind and the narratives that shape our world, so as to make tangible differences in the face of the big issues of our times. So that's a bit bold, but you can think, for example, of the SDGs, if you wish, something that is kind of ambitious enough. The rationale for the project is that conceptual engineering, to me, still lacks of what I would call an implementation strategy. By that, I mean that it is still not an operational method. It has still no operational method for it to run its case studies in a way that is effective, in a satisfying way. And the project is somehow, the main aim of the project is somehow to fill that applied knowledge gap, if you wish. So the overall goal of the project is then to make conceptual engineering what I call an effective tool to achieve real-world changes with measurable impact. And this whole goal is in turn divided, if you wish, into two different objectives. The one I call the theoretical objective, and the other one is the applied objectives. So let's start with the first one, theoretical objectives, and it is the empirical bit of the title of the project and of the talk, namely conceptual engineering as an empirical method. So this objective can be stated as follows, at least it's the way in which I stated in the project. So this objective is to devise the framework of conceptual engineering as a method for producing better concepts that are apt to be adopted by the relevant target user communities. And this theoretical objective is itself made of 3 interdisciplinary scientific aims, as they call it in their jargon, in this kind of fellowship schemes, if you wish. So the first aim concerns the engineering process itself. And the aim here is to devise an uptake-driven, effective methodological framework, a model or framework for engineering concepts. The question that is addressed here is then how to design the method of conceptual engineering, and the strategy that I adopt, or that I will adopt if eventually the project gets funded at some point, is twofold, if you wish. On the one hand, I would like to try to obtain some sort of common template out of what they call in engineering sciences, the engineering design process. And on the other hand, I would like to combine that template framework with the so-called explication-based tradition that goes back to Carnap, obviously, in conceptual engineering. So I will start telling you a bit more on this. So, sorry about that. So, not a lot, but still something has been said on what engineering is or should be in the case of conceptual engineering. And what I've gathered so far is this. So you have this basic characterization that you find in Kaplan 2017, 2018, as conceptual engineering as being about assessing, improving concepts or representational devices. It has been somehow extended by the next phase, which is the implementation phase in the Kaplan-Plunkett Introduction to the OUP Volume 2020. You also find a threefold project that has been somehow delineated by Matti Eklund in his forthcoming article in volume that is edited by Rachel Sterken and Justin Koo, Routledge, handbook, philosophy of language and social something, sorry about that, in which Matti speaks in terms of prescriptive project, evaluative project, and mapping project. So you have here 4 distinct components. So the evaluative, assessing, prescriptive, improving, implementation, and the mapping, which is kind of more descriptive in its mindset, if you wish. These different components of the project has been somehow thought in terms of the relationship they have to each other in the recent paper by Dave Plunkett and Alexi Burgess, in which it presents something like a 2 out of 3 model. So conceptual engineering is somehow what is at the intersection of 2 of these 3 or 4 different components. And this relationship have been somehow even improved, if you wish, at least according to my take on what the framework should be, by adopting some sort of dynamic approach to these different components that you find, for example, in the work that goes back to Carnapian explication. So you have something that has been dubbed the Carnapian recipe for explicating concept by Georg Brun in his 2016 synthèse paper. And the recent, what I would call engineering inspired, if you wish. I mean, it's clear, at least in Dave Chalmers' case, but as well in James Ondo's recent paper that is called Fully Experimental Conceptual Engineering. Both pieces have been edited by my friend Stephen Koch and I in the special issue of Inquiry that we are currently co-editing on the foundational issues in conceptual engineering. So this is somehow the kind of engineering framework, and what I like in the Carnapian tradition is this kind of set of weighted criteria of adequacy. As Mashri puts it, Carnap's criteria, as well as their relative importance, govern or may well govern, and by default and thus diffusively any conceptual explication. So I have something to say that is kind of limited to the fact that it concerns explication, which is that's the way in which Georg Brun puts it, a form of conceptual engineering that serves theoretical purposes. And I take it to be some sort of limitation of the Carnapian framework, at least in its original fragrance, if you wish. I mean, Katarina has worked a lot, to extend a bit the framework towards social issues and these kind of things. But I mean, that's another topic. I have a lot to say about that, but not now. I mean, I've already enough things to say during this talk, not to get distracted. So my proposal here is to obtain, with regard to the methodological framework, is to obtain what I call a 5-stage model of conceptual amelioration, which would be both non-linear in the sense that they might be back and forth between the different stages, and iterative in the sense that when you reach the last stage, you may have to come back to the first stage. I call it the DID-time model because it's the acronym that you have out of each of the component of the model. So the first step is descriptive step, during which you map the target conceptual territory, if you wish, which is a regimented process. So it also already have something that is kind of normative in it, if you wish. Then you evaluate the functional quality of the different targets concept you may have in mind. So the functional quality is a kind of tricky bit because you can put a lot of things in it, but we may well discuss this in the Q&A if you wish. Then you design you improved concept based on the evaluation on step 2, and you test it. That's very important in order to assess whether the new concept that you've come up designing would worth being trying to be implemented. That's the next step. So you test it and you assess it in terms of added value, in terms of costs, and cognitive cost or whatever, in terms of feasibility constraint, the way in which it may happen to, for example, have some uptake in its target user communities, if you wish, and so on. And eventually you may come to implement the process and to try to actively propagate the concept you've come to newly to design. So that's it for the engineering bit. Next, we can move to the second, I call it the scientific aim. If you remember back to the presentation of the overall theoretical objective, if you wish. So the second scientific aim concerns the target objects for conceptual engineering. The aim here is to obtain target object that would be operationalizable. Sorry, it's a bit hard to pronounce to me. Operationalizable for conceptual engineering. So the question here is, what should conceptual engineering be operating on? And my strategy is to kind of come up with 3 desiderata that I think conceptual engineering or conceptual engineers should be kind of careful with, and to use them in order to compare the competing options that are on the table with regard to what conceptual engineering should be operating on. These 3 main desiderata are impact, which concerns the connection conceptual engineering may have to people's mind, be it direct versus indirect. The second is that of scope, which I think of in terms of range of tractable items for conceptual engineering. Is it broad or narrow? And the last desiderata that I would like to satisfy is that of flexibility, which is to be sought in terms of appropriateness for the calibration of the standard according to which we'll evaluate the quality of a given concept or more broadly representational device. And here you may oppose fine grain versus coarse grain, or high versus low flexibility, if you wish. So my proposal here consists somehow in engineering what concept or conceptual should mean or means in the label of conceptual engineering. And the claim that I'm kind of defending here is that conceptual engineering should be about concepts on being pragmatically inconsistent otherwise, concepts psychologically theorized as opposed to semantically theorized, on pain or limiting the impact, the scope, and or the flexibility of the whole project otherwise, and psychologically theorized as multiply functional kind, in order to further boost impact, scope, and flexibility. So I will tell you a bit more on all of these 3 components of my proposal. With regard to the project itself, so I've kind of worked a lot on the 2 first components of the proposal. For the project itself, what I still need to do a lot of work on is the very last component, namely designing a psychological model of concept that is kind of well suited to the purposes of conceptual engineering. Another thing that I would very much like to do, it's not that I would like to do, it's part of the project, in fact, it's to extend that kind of endeavor to transpose it to the case of linguistic models of concepts with the same desiderata. One thing that would be very striking difference between the linguistic and psychological model of concepts is that in the linguistic case, you would then be dealing with concepts at a communal level, whereas in the psychological case, as you will see when I will go a bit further into the details of the framework, and I draw a lot, for example, on Mashri's 2009 book and its further work in the psychology of concepts, the framework is very much individualistic. So you target people's individual mind and not a concept as some kind of entities that are shared by different thinker, for example, or cognizer, if you wish. And the other thing that would be important with regard to the linguistic model is that it would enable us or me, the project to deal with issues such as, which I take to be very critical for the whole project of conceptual engineering, which is that which concerns what has been done by Herman Kaplan in his book 2018, the so-called lexical effects. So about concepts, as I said, so it should be about concept. So my argument, I will tell you a few bit on that, but not go very much into the detail of the arguments. So why should it be about concepts? So and not about any other kind of representational devices, if you wish. It's because otherwise conceptual engineering, if it is not about concepts, then the label conceptual engineering is a misnomer. I mean, as Kaplan and Plunkett puts it in their introduction to the OUP volume, it has been just chosen on their picture, which is not mine, just for aesthetic reason, because it rolls, what's the English word for that? It's roll on the tongue better than representational device engineering would have. So that's the reason they gave in the chapter, at least. And I think that it's kind of pretty worrying, because you then face a twofold dilemma. So what you can do, if you agree that conceptual engineering is then a misnomer, is that you can change the label, but no one is likely to do that, because people are far too keen on exploiting its lexical effect and its lexical power. So very few people would be willing to change the label for representational device engineering, for instance, if you wish. So people want to keep on going with the very same label, but then you either face self-discrediting predicament, as I've called it in a recent paper in Inquiry, in the sense that conceptual engineering are those people who are meant to come up with good labels or good coining for concepts, and you end up with something that is misleading, which might be taken as some sort of cognitive impediment, if you wish, and then you would somehow discredit your own abilities to create better representational devices. Or you do not care about it being some sort of misnomer, but then you are turned into what Kaplan in the book calls an exploiter, who is in the business of branding IDs in order to trigger cognitive and non-cognitive effects, however misleading they are. So I quote the following passage by Herman, which I find very inspiring. It might turn out that even for us philosophers, a significant amount of our work consists in trying to trigger the right kind of lexical effects. Most likely, a name can also make you more disposed to accept, say, a philosophical theory. It is, after all, cheaper to accept a philosophical theory than to buy a bottle of Coke. So you would expect the barrier to be lower. That's it. So next, psychologically theorized. So here, the opposition is the dichotomy. I build on the kind of widely acknowledged, albeit controversial, dichotomy between two models of concepts, one of which is that of philosophy, the other is that of psychology. The first one conceives of concepts as being some sort of semantic entities made of semantic structures, which basically works as the component of our thought content and which primarily serve a referential function. Psychological model, in a position, if you wish, conceive of concepts as being some sort of cognitive entities endowed with processing structures, and that work as the explanants for our higher cognitive activities, which serve in particular categorizing functions. Sorry for that. So here, I kind of arbitrate between those by using the three desiderata that I've mentioned before, namely impact, scope, and flexibility. I go through these very quickly here because I have not enough time, I guess, to properly argue for that. But it's just to, and it's not part of the project. It's more in the background. It's something I would build on in order for the project to tackle the new challenge that it put forward. So the idea with God impact is that the psychological model only grants you a direct impact on people's mind, because in that case, concepts basically are the constitutive principles for the cognitive processes of real cognitive agents, as opposed to the philosophical pictures, according to which concepts basically work as some sort of regulatory principle for the rational processes of some sort of idealized epistemic as opposed to cognitive agents. With regard to scope and flexibility, I also think and argue that psychological model should prevail over the philosophical alternative, and the reason for that is that on the psychological picture, concepts are first and foremost pragmatically responsive and efficacy driven. It will become a bit clearer when I move to the presentation of the model in the next slide. And they allow for many different criteria with regard to which assessing the quality of a given concept, thereby allowing for broad scope. You can basically operate on any kinds of different concepts, not being restricted to theoretical concepts, say, and you have a high flexibility in the sense that you are not constrained by those of rationality, the constraint of rationality, in the sense that you may well allow for improvement that would be, according to the standards of rationality, somehow detrimental to the epistemic process of a given epistemic agent. while they actually are more conducive to achieving our cognitive purposes as a human being, having to cope with some sort of changing world. So that's basically it. We can go back to this in the Q&A if you wish. That's more, as I said before, in the background of the project. The next slide is a bit more kind of uh, central to the project. At least this is something that will really serve as some sort of cornerstone on which to build that part of the project. And here I give you the functional. So it is that bit concerns conceiving the model, the psychological model of concept that I intend to um, rely on, which I characterize as being um, about multiply realized functional kinds. So the functional bit of the label concerns the fact that according to the characterization that you may find, for example, in Mashri, 2009, in all his work, in 2011, 2015, and so on, but he speaks again in these terms in his latest book, 2017. Concepts are these bodies of information that are retrieved by default from our long-term memory to play a causal explanatory role in the processes that underlie the activation of our higher cognitive competencies, that is categorization, action planning, inference making, analogy drawing, and so on. And so that's for the functional bit of the label. Now, the multiple realization concerns the fact that concepts on Mashri's picture, but that's not only him, that's also, for example, you may think of the work that has been done by someone as Daniel Weisskopf, or the dialogue they had between Mashri and Piccini and Scott and these kind of things. So concepts are, if you wish, realized by different basic kinds, namely exemplar, prototypes, theories, at least some have more than three, and they can be individuated according, Mashri gives a criterion for that. And what is kind of very important with regard to the pluralism that I'm kind of willing to endorse is that it is radical in the sense that these three different bodies of information, exemplar, prototype, theories, are meant to be operating about any kind of reference that goes against what has been called the scope pluralism, according to which exemplars maybe are more about concrete object, whereas, for example, theories would be about some more abstract object and these kind of things. According to the radical pluralism that is kind of endorsed and developed by Mashri, you have these different basic kinds of concepts that are kind of relevant and used about any kind of reference, whatever their ontological status is, if you wish. And it is also absolute. That's my coining of that feature, if you wish, in the sense that they are possibly operating in any kind of cognitive process, those which are listed here. So categorization process, action planning process, inference making process, as opposed to what has been dubbed the competent pluralism, according to which exemplar would be, for example, would only come in play in, say, I don't know, action planning process and so on. So according to the framework that I'm likely to adopt, the pluralism is also operating on with regard to the cognitive processes that are in play here. So to give you kind of a very toy example, and then I move on. So it's very kind of it's a bit silly sometimes toy examples are, but so if you are classifying animal species in the biology classroom, you would be better off replacing your lay concept of fish, for instance, your exemplar-based or your prototype-based concept of fish, by their scientific variant, which may happen in turn to be further improvable, that is replaced for theoretical purposes, such as by the concept of, how to pronounce again, euteleostemy, in a phylogenetic mindset, for instance. Whereas if you are doing your groceries at the market in Japan to cook onomi, your scientific concept of fish would be of no use, while its lay variants may come to be happily modified, that is revised, on the grounds of wildlife conservation and animal rights concerns, for instance, by raising Moby Dick of the list of your exemplar, the exemplars of your exemplar-based concept of fish, or by adding, I don't know, endangered species to the list of the typical properties in your prototype-based concept of fish, and so on. So you get the picture, maybe, I guess. Yeah. So something has been proposed in the workshop that we've had last week by Eugen Fischer in his talk on conceptual engineering, which would be very relevant to it, but I won't mention it here because I'm not sure that I've got the thought properly. But anyway, maybe we can go back to this again in the Q&A. So that's basically it for the target object. And now the last of the three scientific aims that are part of the theoretical objective, first component of the overall project, concern what I call the experimental assistance. So here the aim is to connect the engineering process that we may come to develop in the first with the first scientific aim of the project to its target object in the second scientific aim of the project. And so the question that is somehow to be dealt with here is how to apply the 5-stage model of conceptual engineering, the dead time model, to psychological and linguistic models of concepts. And my strategy here, which is, at least to me, very, very much in progress. I have to think way more on this than just the way in which it is presented here. But still, the strategy is to adapt the dead time model to psychological and linguistic models of concepts via the tools and techniques of experimental philosophy, e.g., the vignette, method of cases, or as Mashri calls it, but as well what is currently done in X5 with regard to the recourse to the method of conceptual corpus analysis in the case of linguistic models of concepts, if you wish, and much more. In fact, I've been absolutely mind blown by the talk that has been given here by David Ludwig a couple of weeks ago, in which he has a very broad understanding of what experimental philosophy amounts to, and is very much willing to include in the package not only the quantitative method but as well the qualitative method that are those which are used by the ethno-linguist, for example, or people doing linguistic description or this kind of things, which are kind of thought in terms of maybe soft science or these kind of things, but which may happen to be very relevant to any kind of endeavor in along the lines I propose. At least that's part of the idea, and I will reflect much more on that, including with David himself. So just to give you a bit of the proposal here, it would be to have something like a fully X5 assisted conceptual engineering. So the fully X5 conceptual engineering is something it's the title of James' paper that I mentioned earlier, James' Endo paper that we've published with Stefan, and you can dub it XCE. It has been done by Kevin, the first second talk of this series of talk this fall. And so to give you an example, so what you can do is a psychological model is that that's the hard word to pronounce again, operationalize the defaultness condition of concept psychologically theorized via a cluster of 3 homeostatic properties, namely speed, automaticity, and context independence. And you can then track and delineate that body of information and distinguish it from further background information that one may have about some category of referent in the outside world. Further exploratory issues are that, so for example, what are the best experimental settings for tracking the pluralist psychological models of concepts? Invariantist, I mentioned invariantist because it's the way in which that notion of defaultness is dubbed in the relevant literature on the topic. Next, what are the parameters to assess the functional efficacy of concepts? Do they vary, and how across the different basic kinds of concepts, exemplar, prototypes, and theories? Or depending on the cognitive competence and processes involved? What about the context? And the last, but there are many more, obviously, what are the main cognitive constraints that bear on the implementation of the newly designed concepts on that psychological picture. Obviously, exploratory issues also extend to the case of linguistic models of concept, in which case, the first of which would be to reflect on which model or framework to draw on in order to come up with a model of concepts. I would be likely, because it has been kind of my expertise, I don't know, but I've kind of worked and reflected a lot on that years ago. The thing that have been done in the early structuralist linguistics, so early in the 20th century, obviously by Ferdinand de Saussure, for instance. But these are the guys who have developed sophisticated, I think, semiotic models as they, or linguistic models and semiotic models as they call it back then. But what I very much like in the way in which they came up with the models is that linguists such as Ferdinand de Saussure are just like the most brilliant and technically brilliant linguist in terms of being informed of the cross linguistic diversity and of the history of languages and of the history of semantics and this kind of thing. So it is very much empirically informed stuff that is, if you wish, at the basement of the way in which they conceived or came with the design of their semiotic models. So that's something I'm kind of likely to draw on, but I'm open to any suggestion, obviously, because it's very early stage of the reflection on that bit. So that is it for the first bit of the project, which was about the theoretical objective. The label was empirical method. So now we can move to the second part of the talk. I promise it is shorter, and but nonetheless, I guess that it is way more unusual, not to say provocative, for philosopher than what I've been saying so far, even though that was already maybe to some of us something that is kind of surprising. So I call this, that's the other bit of the title, Applied Conceptual Engineering. And here the applied objective, obviously, is to translate the new knowledge resources, as they call it in these grant application schemes. That is the method and models that we've developed with the theoretical objective into innovative products and processes, and make these suitable and available to social exploitation. So this objective itself comprises two interconnected strategies: valorization strategies and engagement strategies. And it is at the very heart of the project, I would say. So let's start with the valorization strategy. So valorization strategy, the first part of it consists of a translational operation. It is to transform the method of conceptual engineering, the methodological framework of conceptual engineering, in what I would call a template procedural framework. What I have in mind here, oh, sorry, that's not how it works in the talk. So the target user communities are these of professional concept users and producers. I will tell you much more about who I have in mind here. The model on which this very template procedural framework will be designed is that of the business model canvas, if you know what it is, if you have it in mind, so you can kind of even picture it in your mind. And this model will be then supported by a set of pedagogic protocols, that is online tutorials and practitioner workshop mostly, in order for people, so the professional concept users and producers, to be taught how to use that model, that template procedural framework. So in order to achieve these aims, we'll have two different types of collaborators. On the one hand, a communication agency in charge of the design, the visual design of the framework itself, how to represent it concretely on an A4 sheet, if you wish, and a think tank that work with so-called framework theory. I can tell you way more about this in the Q&A if you wish. So the second step of the valorization strategy is to apply these template procedural framework to specific case studies. So the type of case studies are expected. That's what I said when I introduced the talk and the whole talk itself, of high social and or political significance. And the people who will supply the project with these relevant case studies will be our target user group, namely think tank, NGOs, and policymakers. I mean, mostly think tanks, but I will tell you much more about this and how to interact with them in a second. To do that, how it will work is that I will rely on a global platform for think tanks. There are my collaborators, people with whom I've been kind of working for a long while now, and a few, which is obviously, as it is stated in the very label, a global platform. So they have connecting many different think tanks, different kinds of think tanks from all around the world, especially the global south, in a kind of network and in a kind of platform with different program. They have conferences, how do you call that again? Fellowship programs and these kind of things. And also, I will also connect with different think tank hubs. You have many of them all around the world, but yeah, depending on where the project will be conducted, I will get in touch with the relevant think tank hubs. I'm already in contact with some of them. Yeah, I've been in contact with some of them for a while already. So the second bit, as I said, of the applied objective is the engagement strategy. And it's something that's also very much at the heart of the project, at the core of the project, and that is central to it, in which are partly conceive of philosophy and maybe more broadly of research or academic research. And that's something that I would like very much to get to more and more concerned with. So that's the public engagement strategy. So here, where would that work? So the idea of the project. So that's really a core component of the project. That's the integral part of the project. It is to come to the development of what I call a knowledge co-production platform, which means that the project aims to set up an intersectoral, that is academic and non-academic, bridging the gap between both these worlds, participatory forum for the continuous dialogue and application of the project's knowledge output. So, as I said, the target user group, the target user group, the target group, and the audiences would be primarily that of think tanks. And the reason why, I will tell you much more about that again, because that may trigger some sort of ethical issue in your mind, is that think tanks are these people or this institution who have a certain capacity to generate new evidence and knowledge that inform substantially policymaking and thereby shape public debates. How will they be organized? Well, I won't be doing myself that alone, obviously, because I do not know how to do that, but that will be helped by expert on how to deal with this kind of practical issues, if you wish. So we'll have a rotating selection of think tanks from the collaborators communities, that global platform of think tanks, who will be themselves organized into small communities of practice, that all the words are very important here, of practice sharing common agendas. And so I will be helped, as I said, by that global platform for think tanks, and who will also act as expert dialogue facilitators, because it's not easy, at least to me, to kind of straightforwardly interact with people from the non-academic world, speaking in philosophical terms, if you wish, and trying to have some sort of influence, of impact with your philosophical ideas on these think tanks and eventually policymakers and even more people. So basically, that's it. So I cannot do that alone. I'm helped by this expert dialogue facilitator, and they do know, they're expert in this, that's their business. So how will this work, the model? So the model is to have an inclusive participatory model that will build on a sustained two-way transfer of knowledge in the production of research output. And that's absolutely crucial to the project itself. So the idea is that it's not only academic knowledge produced by philosophers. professional philosophers that comes top down from the academy to the outside world, and tell them what they should do and how they should do it. But it's also very much so a grassroots model, a bottom-up model that builds on the target audience, which will be obviously, as I said before, the case study provider. So case studies here are very much very important in the sense that they will provide the project with these entry point for the in-depth and sustained engagement with all the stakeholders being part of the project, and continuous feedback and guidance throughout the co-creation of the project product. And that's very important. The target audiences themselves, the target user group, if you wish, they will be very much in power of informing the theoretical component of the project, giving us feedback, providing us guidance, and that's very important for many reasons I will come back to in a second. And also something that's kind of important is that case studies will also serve as impact indicators for the project itself. The upshot is thereby, by this kind of bottom-up grassroots model, is to ensure the usefulness, the suitability, and the uptake of the project's knowledge output in the target user groups, and thereby maximize the project's chances of influencing these user groups. So that's very important, again, as well, to build on this two-way transfer of knowledge. Because if you do not do that, I mean, basically, my target audience, at least the way in which I consider it, they just won't listen to me. They won't get involved in the project to begin with. So I need to rely on this very inclusive model of knowledge production. And again, so here, these won't be, I won't be supported by collaborators, but by partners instead. And this would be the selected network of think tanks, which will be kind of working on a rotating basis. We might also have NGOs and policy entrepreneurs involved. The last bit is, so what is the product? What is the output of it for the think tanks themselves? Well, they will get a threefold tool out of conceptual engineering. It will serve them as an analytical tool in order to more accurately understand the whys of policy and existing dominant narratives in a country or sector, such as the narrative of the deserving poor, the tragedy of the commons, and so on. It will also serve them as a strategic tool in order for them to be more efficient in the challenging the prevailing arguments and narratives, or the way in which policy have been formulated and implemented, and an operational tool in order for think tanks to improve their policy recommendation and be more effective in how they want to inform and influence what they want to achieve. And again, in order to do that, I will be supported by communication experts and a think tank that works as a consultancy for think tanks. What is important just to note is that these threefold tools that conceptual engineering could work for think tanks is not something that I came up with. It's when I interacted with them, they told me why it could be very interesting for them to get involved in that, and how they see the project could provide them with some sort of support and help. And that's the reason why they are getting interested in it. So impact measurement, and then I'm moving on. So how do you measure impact for that? Well, you track, you monitor, and you record, observe behavioral changes in the target user communities or groups. Basically, you focus on the ways in which the uses of key concepts at stake in the selected case studies have changed the analytic, strategic, and operational work of the target group. And how do you do that? Well, the people who I intend to work with or collaborate with know very well how to handle this kind of problem. They rely on methods such as the so-called outcome mapping. You can Google it, and there's tons of info. There are tons of info on that, or the so-called logic model that has been dubbed so because of Kellogg's, the logician and inventor of the cornflakes. So I believe. So that's basically it. And the project will also be supported by people acting as development evaluators, namely two distinct types of board, an advisory board and a steering board, which will be composed of the project's collaborators and partners, as well as external mentors. So one last word, that's my last slide before the conclusion, and then I'm done. So because it's something that's kind of been raised by people when I kind of present, I believe the word think tank is a bit scary to many of us, to put it that way. So why think tank? First, so I mentioned that they have this kind of ability to inform policy makers and thereby shape the public debate. But so that's for the event-based expertise, but also to have a whole story to tell on how I got involved into conceptual engineering. But these are the people who I've met during that process, getting involved in conceptual engineering, that are the most abstraction-friendly mindset if you compare that to policymakers themselves or people working in communication agencies or these kind of things. And with regard to conceptual engineering itself, and because I mean, conceptual engineering is always thought as something that is kind of pretty bold. I mean, when you say the way in which, when you see the way in which it is stated, it is always about improving, somehow the world, people's life. It is not only about changing concepts for the sake of semantic beauty. It is about having some sort of real impact on people's life. And but obviously, it's very hard to achieve this as a sole philosopher in the whole wide world. So think tanks, with that respect, can operate as some sort of catalyst for the dissemination of conceptual engineering kind of processes, if you wish. One thing that is kind of important, how think tank, one thing that is kind of important is to gather them into small communities of practices that share a common agenda, as opposed to operating at the macro level and to try, for example, to implement your the conceptual changes you may come up to recommend by relying on, for instance, trendsetters. I mean, I think that it's also very much context dependence. That depends on the context. For example, if you are trying to achieve the reworking or the re-engineering of people's concepts of vaccine, which is very accurate these days, you may well rely on the Queen and Marcus Rashford better than working with small communities of practices. I think that's something that should be done, and that will be done, obviously. But so that's context dependence. What is also maybe context dependence is that I very much rely on this two-way transfer of practical and theoretical knowledge and expertise, as opposed to being patronizing, telling people what they should do. But it is possibly the case that in some instances, given some concepts, for example, the concept of social distancing that has been presented earlier this year, last semester, by Ethan in his talk, you have to be a bit patronizing in order for people, and that's my toy example of social distancing, in order for people to understand that social distancing is not about the government telling us not to see our relatives or to interact with them, but just to keep 2 meters apart from each other. So I have things that I wanted to say, but I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll be quick on this. So I have many kind of genuine case studies, the people that I've kind of been interacting with, the United Nations Human Rights Council has some think tanks working with them. So I've been interacting with these folks and have some sort of fascinating stories with regard to how the resolution gets implemented by the government themselves, and it never works. So I've been interacting as well with so-called future and trend research. I have also a couple of stories that are kind of interesting here. And also people working in social design and innovation. I have some case studies here with regard to the way in which binge drinking, for example, in the Sydney area in Australia, was kind of a huge issue for, I think that it was in Sydney. I'm sorry if it's not the case, please do not take any grudge against me. So it was for a while a huge social issue, and the way in which it was somehow dealt with or solved is not to seeing it as some sort of threat to the social order, if you wish, but as the way in which festive events are to be handled and managed. And that's just the way we're working on the very setting. So that's thing that I found fascinating in interacting with this kind of people, and they were super responsive when being kind of acquainted or presenting very briefly with the idea of conceptual engineering as being about improving our conceptual devices, let's say it this way. So just to say, the project will include something that's very important, obviously, with regard to any kind of ethical issue, a permanent work package, so WP0, that will go throughout the project about so-called RRI. So responsible research and innovation is defined as follows in the H2020 package. I guess that it will be renewed more or less along the same line in the forthcoming Horizon Europe agreement that is about to be published very soon, I guess. So responsible research and innovation implies that all societal actors, researchers, citizens, policymakers, business, sector organization work together during the whole research and innovation process in order to better align the process and its output with the value, needs, and expectations of society. So that's something that we would like to get them more and more acquainted with and know a lot more about for the project itself. And I think that it's kind of critical to us as academic researcher. So that's the conclusion, just one slide. So what does the project do? Well, it builds new synergies between academic and non-academic research in the production of scientific knowledge. The project will transform the way academic research engages inclusively with all its stakeholders and set new trends for the production of research outcome based on sustained two-way transfers of knowledge. The project will thereby promote a form of what they call citizen science. I would prefer citizens research. It will open new opportunities for conceptual engineering to reach bigger audiences, NGOs, policy entrepreneurs, in view of further social exploitation. And the ultimate goal, as I said before, is thereby to make conceptual engineering an effective tool to achieve real-world changes with measurable impact. And that is it. I thank you very much for your attention, as they say.